Welcome to Vegas Hockey Hub here in the sports entertainment capital of the world, Las Vegas, Nevada. Here on PRConnectionsRadio.com, the voice of new media. I'm your host, Ian McKelly. Now, there have been plenty of fan favorites here in Las Vegas. There have been people that have been cheered and celebrated here in Las Vegas since the Vegas Golden Knights were created. But one player that was the ultimate fan favorite, one player who symbolized and characterized the Vegas Golden Knights, a player who became the face of Vegas from day one. Just happens to be that guy right there, Marc-Andre. Now, the people here in Las Vegas, even 2 full years after he got traded, there are still fan pages. There are people who celebrate Marc-Andre Fleury still. But a question arises, what has happened to Marc-Andre Fleury since leaving the Vegas Golden Knights? Since he got traded in July of 2021, what has happened to the guy who was the face of the franchise? What has happened to a player who was at one point the symbolism of Vegas, who was the heart and soul of the Vegas Golden Knights? Now, to give you some context, I want to take a look back because it's very important to look back and see what happened with Marc-Andre Fleury when he was playing here in Vegas. So, his statistics with the Vegas Golden Knights are very important to give you that historical context. In his 4 seasons playing for the Vegas Golden Knights, when Marc-Andre Fleury was the starting goaltender night in and night out for the Vegas Golden Knights, over those 4 seasons, 117 wins, 60 losses, 14 overtime losses, but he had an incredible 23 shutouts in that 4-year span. He essentially averaged 5.5 shutouts season when he was playing in Vegas. Now, that 91.7 save percentage, that is around average in the NHL. But that 2.41 goals against average is remarkable. I will point out, when it came to Marc-Andre Fleury and the statistics that he had in Vegas, is what made him one of the best goalies in hockey. His statistics and his analytics in Vegas is one of the main reasons why he has been with the NHL for 19 years. As a matter of fact, there is one season in particular that made Marc-Andre Fleury a big name here in Vegas. And it was that 2020-2021 season. He went 26-10 with a 1.98 goals against average and a 92.8 save percentage. He also had 6 shutouts that year. Marc-Andre Fleury in that 2020-2021 campaign at the age of 36 years old had the best goals against average in his career. He had the second best save percentage of his career. The only one that was better was in 2017-2018 when it was around 92.8. So Marc-Andre Fleury, that 2017-2018 season where they went to the Stanley Cup playoffs, when they went to the Stanley Cup final with Marc-Andre Fleury, that was incredible. But 3 seasons later in 2020-2021, the final season he had in Vegas, when he won the Vezina as the best goaltender in hockey, when he shared the Jennings Trophy with fellow goaltender Robin Lehner for the best goalie tandem in terms of goals against average. Marc-Andre Fleury, in 4 seasons with the Vegas Golden Knights, he ended up putting up stellar numbers. Those statistics right there back it up for yourself. Marc-Andre Fleury ended up having an incredible tenure in Vegas. But unfortunately, we all know what happens next. We are all familiar with what ends up happening afterwards. Or as I put it, the trade that shocked Vegas. On July 27th, 2021, your fan favorite Marc-Andre Fleury was traded from the Vegas Golden Knights to the Chicago Blackhawks for prospect Mikael Hakkarainen. Now, for anyone who wants to know what happened to Mikael Hakkarainen, well, I'm actually going to tell you exactly what ended up happening. He is not even on the Golden Knights anymore. As a matter of fact, he did not even play for the Vegas Golden Knights organization. What happened to him afterwards is a very interesting story. So what ended up happening is that he gets traded for Marc-Andre Fleury. He gets put on waivers on August 18th, 2021, 1 month later. Then he goes to the Finnish league and he actually played for TPS out there in Finland after that year. So he didn't even play for the Vegas Golden Knights. He actually never even had a game for the team. Now, I will say, unfortunately, he retired at the age of 22 due to a heart disease. So, unfortunately, his career did not turn out what some people hoped. But the fact that he still played professional hockey in Finland, that's actually quite good. So, back to the trade. So, on July 27th, 2021, when Marc-Andre Fleury gets traded from the Golden Knights, goes to the Chicago Blackhawks, there was speculation on why Marc-Andre Fleury got traded. There was speculation on how this trade happened. Why was it Chicago? There were so many factors that went into this trade 2 years ago. And even though we could do an entire hour and I could bring on a guest, I could bring on someone who would bring a very passionate argument as to why Marc-Andre Fleury got traded from the Vegas Golden Knights. We could go all the way down the rabbit hole and talk about George McPhee, Kelly McCrimmon. We could talk about his agent, Alan Walsh. We could do all of that. But instead, let's do what we need to do. Let's talk about how Marc-Andre Fleury performed in Chicago. Let's analyze what his performance was, how he performed as a starting goaltender in Chicago during his brief tenure with the organization. Because some people are going to forget that Marc-Andre Fleury played 45 games for the Chicago Blackhawks in 2020, 2021. And his stat line in Chicago was not pretty. 19 wins, 26 losses, 5 of them being in overtime, a 90.8 save percentage, which once again is around average, and his 2.95 goals against average was a little bit worse than what he was doing in Vegas. The one positive that Marc-Andre Fleury had as a Chicago Blackhawk was his reception when he went back to Vegas and the reaction, the applaud, and the standing ovation Marc-Andre Fleury got when he returned to T-Mobile Arena as a Chicago Blackhawk. Also, he received votes for the Lady Byng Trophy that season. So, as credited with the Chicago Blackhawks, he did receive votes that year for the most gentlemanly player in the NHL. So, Marc-Andre Fleury only had 45 starts with the Chicago Blackhawks, like I stated. And that tenure in Chicago did not go as well as some people anticipated. He did not save the Chicago Blackhawks from tearing each other apart. Also, he came at a really bad time in terms of timing. Because when Marc-Andre Fleury was suiting up the Chicago Blackhawks, you had the Kyle Beach situation develop, and you had the scandal break out in Chicago that eventually got people fired inside that organization. So he really was dealt a bad hand in Chicago because not only was the team bad, but the culture was bad, and you had a scandal that rocked the entire organization from top to bottom. There was also a head coaching change. Jeremy Colleton was no longer the head coach. There was a lot to go wrong in Chicago. And to be brutally honest with you, I do not blame any of those stats on Marc-Andre Fleury. There's really nothing Marc-Andre Fleury could have done in Chicago to fix Seth Jones and Caleb Jones on the defense. You really can't fix the fact that the bottom six in Chicago had a bunch of filler on that line. So I don't blame Marc-Andre Fleury for 19 wins, 21 losses, and 5 overtime losses. I would not blame Marc-Andre Fleury for having a decline in Chicago. I believe you put any goaltender in the NHL, outside of maybe Andre Vasilevsky, put pretty much any goaltender in the NHL, put them in that Chicago team that year, and you would have too. But the 2022 NHL deadline was very important. As a matter of fact, Marc-Andre Fleury was being rumored to be going everywhere in the 2022 NHL trade deadline. There was talk about him going back to Pittsburgh. There was talk about Marc-Andre Fleury going to Edmonton. There was talk about him going to Toronto. There was so many conversations and so many rumor mills about Marc-Andre Fleury because people saw the writing on the wall. People knew that Marc-Andre Fleury was not going to spend another season in Chicago. He was not going to be a long-term goalie in Chicago. So, sure enough, at the 2022 NHL trade deadline, Marc-Andre Fleury got traded from the Chicago Blackhawks and goes to the Minnesota Wild for a 2022 second-round pick. Now, this is going to be a two-parter here. The first part is going to be analyzing the back end of the 2022 season. The second part will be analyzing the front of the 2022-2023 season. All right, because both of these seasons are very important about what happened to Marc-Andre Fleury since leaving Vegas. Now, the first part is his stat line with the Minnesota Wild that past season. He had 11 starts, 9-2, and a 91.0 save percentage. His goals against average was ironically enough the same, but his save percentage was a little bit better, and his win-loss record was noticeably different. I mean, Marc-Andre Fleury teaming up with Cam Talbot was a big deal. The Minnesota Wild, an organization that really don't have Stanley Cup champions on their team, got a 3-time Stanley Cup champion in net for a playoff run this past playoff year. Now, the one note that I have to point out is that Marc-Andre Fleury, Cam Talbot, they played in the 2022 Stanley Cup playoff. Cam Talbot played one game for the Minnesota Wild in this past playoff. Marc-Andre Fleury started the other 5. Marc-Andre Fleury was the starting goaltender for Minnesota Wild in 2022 NHL playoffs. And Marc-Andre Fleury in that timeline, when Marc-Andre Fleury played in that 2022 Stanley Cup playoff, you actually have to mention, and I actually will mention this, his stat line for that playoff, it was not pretty. He had 2 wins, 3 losses, a 3.04 goals against average, and a 90.6 save percentage. That 3.04 goals against average was the worst since 2013 when he had a 3.51 with the Pittsburgh Penguins. And that 90.6 was the worst playoff save percentage he had since 2016 when he was the backup to Matt Murray. So when Marc-Andre Fleury had a little bit of a down year in Minnesota, when that playoff run did not go according to plan, people asked, would Minnesota bring him back? Would the Minnesota Wild bring back a 37-year-old goaltender after having a not so great playoff run? Well, what ended up happening with Marc-Andre Fleury is that he ended up re-signing with the Minnesota Wild. And not only did he re-sign with them, he signed a team-friendly deal to stay in Minnesota. He signed a 2-year deal worth $7 million to return to Minnesota. And the one other move that was made during this timeline that a lot of people, including myself, had to look at and kind of question Minnesota's mindset on this. The month after they signed Marc-Andre Fleury, the Minnesota Wild do a goalie swap with the Ottawa Senators. They swap Cam Talbot and Philippe Gustafson. And it was actually fascinating because when it came to the Minnesota Wild, they essentially traded a veteran in Cam Talbot. They traded a guy who had been part of the Minnesota Wild for the past 3 or 4 years, and they traded a 35-year-old for a young, up-and-coming 24-year-old in Philippe Gustafson. Now, I will say about Gustafson, the ironic part about this, he was a 2016 second-round pick with the Pittsburgh Penguins. So, Marc-Andre Fleury and Philippe Gustafson actually crossed paths before. However, they were not on the same team. They were just in the same organization at the end of Marc-Andre Fleury's tenure in Pittsburgh. And there's also an ironic part. When Philippe Gustafson got traded to Ottawa, it was in a 3-team deal. In that 2018 season, when they got traded to Ottawa, he was traded in a deal with the Pittsburgh Penguins and with the Vegas Golden Knights. That was the trade that sent Ryan Reeves from Pittsburgh to Vegas. So that's a little fun fact for you. So Philippe Gustafson and Marc-Andre Fleury actually had to cross paths twice because he was drafted by Pittsburgh and then got dealt to Ottawa in the 3-team deal that included Vegas. So there you go. Now, he signs that 2-year deal with the Minnesota Wild. Okay? He ends up signing that deal. He is going to be a Minnesota Wild for the next 2 seasons. So how did Marc-Andre Fleury perform for the Minnesota Wild? How did his 2022-2023 season go? How did Marc-Andre Fleury end up being for the Minnesota Wild in his career? Now, the first 5 games of Marc-Andre Fleury's tenure in Minnesota was absolutely abysmal. His first 5 games for the Minnesota Wild, he ended up having 2 wins and 3 losses. But in that time period, he had 7 goals allowed in his season debut against the New York Rangers. He ended up letting up 4 goals and a 71.4 save percentage in a loss against the LA Kings. He had a save percentage of less than 90% and gave up 4 goals in an overtime loss to the Boston Bruins. And the one win he had against the Vancouver Canucks, he let up 3 goals and had a goals against average of 88.5. Heading in to late October, Marc-Andre Fleury had the worst goals against average out of every starting goalie in the NHL. His goals against average was in the 5s heading into late October. And there was some people that said that Marc-Andre Fleury would get benched by Philippe Gustafson. There was some people out there who said that Marc-Andre Fleury's struggles the first 5 games of the year was a sign that Marc-Andre Fleury had hit father time. That Marc-Andre Fleury was at the end of his career. Well, the next 2 games that he had against Montreal and against Ottawa showed something different. He only let up 1 goal in a win against Montreal. he had a win and only let up 2 goals against Ottawa. And then when they went back to Montreal, he had a 97.1 save percentage and won the game by only allowing 1 goal. So in the span of that, what they call the Canadian stretch, when he took on Montreal twice and took on Ottawa, he ended up changing his entire goals against average and changed his save percentage with just those 4 games. But keep in mind, like I said, that first 4 games, he had a save percentage of 84.7 and had a goals against average of 5. Then, after that time that he takes on Montreal and Ottawa, his save percentage went up to 89.4, and his goals against average settled to about 3.8. So, what happened the last 4 games for Marc-Andre Fleury? Because those 4 games is something I need to acknowledge. As a matter of fact, games 9 through 12 sets up what I'm about to say next. So he has a 2-game series against the Seattle Kraken. The first game when they're playing in Minnesota, he had 4 goals allowed and an 82.6 save percentage and a loss to Seattle. Now keep in mind that the Seattle Kraken expansion team was terrible last year. Was one of the worst expansion teams in the NHL. They did not replicate what Vegas did. So for Marc-Andre Fleury to have 4 goals allowed and an 82.6 save percentage was alarming. Then he goes against Seattle. He plays in Seattle and has a perfect 28 for 28 and has a shutout, his first of the year. That game against Seattle was a complete Jekyll and Hyde experience. He went from being showed up and looking like an exposed veteran playing in Minnesota against Seattle to then going to Seattle, playing at the Climate Pledge Arena, and pitching out in total shutout against Seattle. So Marc-Andre Fleury still has some solid moments. And I will give credit where credit is due. Marc-Andre Fleury can still be an effective goalie in the NHL. So the next 2 games on that calendar is very important. So he takes on the LA Kings. All right, they go to LA, they play at the Crypto.com arena, and in a 1-goal loss, the Minnesota Wild and LA Kings, that was a game where the LA Kings won 1-0. This was not on Marc-Andre Fleury. I cannot blame Marc-Andre Fleury, his 96.7 save percentage. I cannot blame that on him. As a matter of fact, you can blame the Minnesota Wild offense for not putting a puck in the back of the net. Because majority of the time in the NHL, if your starting goalie only allows 1 goal, you're going to win that game 75 or more percent of the time. As a matter of fact, you're going to win that game 75% of the time if you let only 1 goal in on the opposite side. Then, the last game that Marc-Andre Fleury played before the taping of this episode, they go to Nashville. They go to the Bridgestone Arena in Nashville. And Marc-Andre Fleury stops 23 goals out of 25 shots. However, the main story that I have to talk about is what happened late in the game. Marc-Andre Fleury suffered an upper body injury in that 2-1 loss to the Nashville Predators. Now, Marc-Andre Fleury suffered the injury, but nobody can specify when he got injured. There have been people who have looked back at the tape of the late end of the Nashville game, and they cannot tell a certain moment or a certain play or a certain shot that would have caused the upper body injury. All they know is that Marc-Andre Fleury played 57 of the 60 minutes that night against Nashville. Then, somewhere around the end of the game, Marc-Andre Fleury suffers that upper body injury, and he is now placed on injured reserve for the 2022-2023 season. So, will Marc-Andre Fleury play for the Minnesota Wild again this season? That is up to be determined. Will Marc-Andre Fleury be out for a month and a half, 2 months, 3 months? Really all depends on how bad the upper body injury is. I also need to remind you that this is the same Marc-Andre Fleury that missed a certain amount of time in Vegas due to a concussion. This is also the same Marc-Andre Fleury that has had injuries affect his career in Pittsburgh. So, when it comes to Marc-Andre Fleury, when it comes to his injury concerns, this might be something that you're going to have to address in Minnesota. So to recap what we're talking about, to recap the whole point of this episode, what has happened to Marc-Andre Fleury since in Minnesota? Well, that's going to be very simple. What happened to Marc-Andre Fleury is that he went to Chicago and had a failure as a Blackhawk. He goes to the Minnesota Wild, helps him clinch a playoff spot, and loses in the first round to St. Louis. Then, in his second season in Minnesota, he has an awful start to the year, rebounds, and then gets injured 17 games into the NHL season. So, what has happened to Marc-Andre Fleury in Minnesota? Underwhelming would be the answer. Marc-Andre Fleury, unfortunately, has not been the face of the franchise he was in Vegas. He has unfortunately not done to Minnesota what he did in Pittsburgh, and that's win a Stanley Cup. I know for a fact that there are people that are going to be looking at that right there and saying, could have Vegas won that if Marc-Andre Fleury is still here? Could the Minnesota Wild win this if Marc-Andre Fleury was not injured this season? Well, the problem with what ifs is that it's just that. It's a what if. So, the 3-time Stanley Cup champion Marc-Andre Fleury, he unfortunately did not hoist that in Vegas. Unfortunately, he never got to do it. But my argument's going to be this. Marc-Andre Fleury, as long as he is in Minnesota, I don't see that roster as a Stanley Cup champion. They have some good talent on the back end, but they do not have enough talent on the front in order to win a championship. And I'm going to address a question real quick. Can Marc-Andre Fleury get to 552 to pass Patrick Waugh? My answer is going to be simple and straight to the point. No, he will not. The reason why Marc-Andre Fleury will not get to 552 is because right now he is at 526. That means that he would have to have 26 more wins in his career. This is a guy that just got injured in Minnesota. This is a guy that had 19 wins in Chicago last year. This is a guy who unfortunately is getting older and not younger. So to answer your question, do I think that Marc-Andre Fleury can get to 552 wins? The only way that's possible is if Marc-Andre Fleury scored 20 wins this year and then returned and scored 20 wins next year. That's the only way I could see it happening. Is if Marc-Andre Fleury plays 2 more seasons and does what he did in Vegas, does what he did in Pittsburgh. So, this is Vegas Hockey Hub. I'm your host, Ian Rickelli. And until next time, continue watching hockey, go support junior hockey, and go Knights. go.